The Dukes marched to their own drummer. They were independent-minded people. Now, one of the best and early examples of that is right after the Civil War, when the Republican Party first comes into North Carolina. It had not existed anywhere in the South before the Civil War, but it comes into the South as part of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Washington Duke became a Republican. Now, that was not a country club sort of thing to do. It was not a stylish thing to do at all, because in the eyes of the white majority, Washington Duke was one of, now there were other white Republicans, they were known as scallywags. You know, the carpetbaggers were the northern-born Republicans who came south. Well, the Republican Party in the South, after the Civil War, consisted of, the great majority of them, when the African Americans got the vote, most of the blacks became Republicans. Carpetbaggers and scallywags. Washington Duke became a lifelong Republican, and so did Ben, and then Buck later too. You know, Buck's idea of the greatest president the nation ever had was William McKinley. And he had this huge statue of William McKinley on his estate in New Jersey. I think Doris later gave it to some little town in Ohio. But they weren't afraid to be different. In 1896, I think it was, Washington Duke told the new president of Trinity College, President Kilgo, that he would give Trinity $100,000, which was a lot of money then, if Trinity would admit women on an equal footing with men. Well, Kilgo and the trustees of Trinity said, we'd love to have women, we'd be glad to have women. So long before Charlottesville or Chapel Hill smelled the coffee, Trinity College is admitting women on an equal footing with men. Now, they didn't have the facilities for them, and they wouldn't have until later on when the Women's College comes into existence as part of Duke University. But Trinity began to admit women quite early. One of the earliest interests of the family outside of Durham was the Oxford Orphans Asylum, which is still up in Oxford, North Carolina. Washington Duke, Pa and Ben would get on the early morning train back in the days when we had a lot of train service and ride up to Oxford, spend the day at the orphanage, see what they needed, and then see that they got what they could give to help the orphanage. So that later portion of the child care section of the endowment grew out of a pattern of family involvement. From a very early period, Washington Duke and then Ben and Buck gave money to the Methodist Church, and particularly to poor Methodist churches and to Methodist preachers. So that portion of the endowment grew out of the family pattern. Now, I used to fudge a bit. I used to slide over this and argue that the Duke's business partner, George Watts, gave Watts Hospital to the white people of Durham in the 1890s. Well, the Dukes contributed to that, and I'm sure Ben Duke sat on the Board of Trustees and so forth. And then in the early years of the 20th century, 1901 or 2, I can't remember, Ben and Buck gave the money for a hospital for the African Americans in Durham, the Lincoln Hospital. So as I say, I used to fudge here and say, well, the hospital business was unnatural. Now, that was an error because the Dukes were not really very much involved in health care. The health care portion of the Duke Endowment is primarily Buck Duke's original contribution, or his singular contribution to the whole endowment pattern. That business of helping communities build nonprofit community hospitals. That was Buck Duke's vision. You'd help those communities who were willing to help themselves. They had to do some digging themselves for money, and then the endowment would move in and help them. And then the idea of help for the indigents. Back in the days when the average cost for a hospital, $3 was it? I can't remember. The endowment was going to give $1 for each day of care given to poor people. That was a very visionary sort of plan. This is back in the days when the federal government had nothing to do at all with health care. Now, after World War II, the federal government moved in with the Hill-Burton Act, and sort of inspired and modeled after the Duke Endowment's program, helped communities get community hospitals. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we got Medicare for the aged and Medicaid for the poor. But the Duke Endowment started doing all that back in the 20s. And that, of course, I think that was not a family. That was Buck Duke's addition. In the business area, I think the most creative thing he did was the Duke Power Company. This was a phenomenally creative, visionary sort of enterprise. He got into hydroelectric power when it was the frontier and so many people were scared of electricity. They had to sell the idea of electricity to a lot of mill owners, textile mill owners, because they were scared of it. But I think that was a tremendously creative sort of thing. Now, one reason he got into hydroelectricity was because he didn't talk a lot about his motives, the reasons for doing things, and he never once used the term New South, as far as I know. I never saw it. But he was distressed about the poverty of this region after the Civil War. He grew up in it. And I think he saw textile manufacturing as the best avenue out of this poverty. And of course, he wanted to sell hydroelectricity to these textile mills. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So that the Carolina Piedmont became one of the great centers of the textile industry. Now, that day has passed, of course, but the textile industry laid a foundation for what today is one of the most prosperous, economically advanced regions in the country. I think Mr. Duke would understand why the endowment has had to evolve. It's had to change with the times. He certainly was willing to change. He was quite adaptable to new circumstances. He recognized that changed circumstances often required a change of direction. Established cigarette manufacturers in Richmond used hand rollers. And they said the American men who were smoking, a few women were smoking on the sly, but mostly they were men, preferred hand-rolled cigarettes. Well, Buck Duke had heard about this machine in Virginia, the Bonsack machine, to make manufacture cigarettes. And he said, we ought to take a gamble on that. And he persuaded, here's his business genius early on. He's the leading business person in the partnership, but he's the youngest. He said, we ought to gamble on that Bonsack cigarette machine. And he persuaded Pa and Ben and George Watts to do that. And of course, that paid off very handsomely because within 5 years' time, by 1890, Washington Duke Sons and Company was the leading cigarette manufacturer in the nation. And when the American Tobacco Company is organized in 1890, they elect young 33-year-old Buck Duke as the president. And he's on his way to great wealth with that position. And they're going to use a lot of that money to start textile mills, Irwin Mills here in Durham, and there were other mills they owned in the Carolinas. So he was quite adaptable.
Great
and I think he would appreciate the fact that the endowment has had to be adaptable. He was a hard worker, very hard worker, really what we would call a workaholic. He loved his work. He loved creating, building. He built this tremendous tobacco company, this international tobacco company. And then, of course, the classic example of building is the Duke Power Company. That was literally constructing, you see. So he was a hard worker who liked to build, very intelligent, very quick thinking. One of his associates described him as a man who could make up his mind. You present him with a set of facts, a bit of data, and you could almost hear the wheels turning. He thought fast, and he made his decisions quickly. He had a great instinct for picking people with great ability and good character. He treated them very generously and with great respect, and they reciprocated that. So it was associated throughout his whole career with people who played a big role in his success. But he rewarded them, and then they in turn stuck by him. And so those are some of the characteristics of him as a businessman.